I think I'll do a few introductions just while we're waiting for everyone to finish joining the Zoom room. And welcome to those of you who are already here and to those of you joining us on Facebook. So my name is Natalie Pearson and I work at the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre at the University of Sydney. And we're bringing you this special webinar series on economic and social development. And tonight is the last in the economic and social development series, and in fact, the last in the series that's been running throughout 2021. So thank you for making the time to join us. We're going out with a bang with Professor Susan Park tonight. So I'd like to extend my thanks to her for joining us. Before we get underway, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and to recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. I'm currently on the land of the Bidjigal people and the university's campuses are based on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and to further acknowledge the traditional owners on the country on which you may be joining us from tonight as well. So as I said, tonight we are joined by my colleague, Professor Susan Park. Susan is Professor of Global Governance at the University of Sydney, where she's based in the School of Social and Political Sciences. She has a long-standing commitment to global environmental politics, and her research focuses on global governance, both in terms of the shift to renewable energy and the topic of tonight's talk, if and how international grievance mechanisms operate to provide justice for communities harmed by international energy and development projects. A really fascinating topic. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about it. I'd particularly like to acknowledge that Susan published her book on this topic called Environmental Recourse at the Multilateral Development Banks with Cambridge Press last year. And so congratulations on that book, Susan. We're really looking forward to hearing more about EcoJustice for harm from international development tonight. Susan's going to speak to us for about 30 minutes and that will be followed by a Q&A. Without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Susan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and for everyone at SEAC. So it's a pleasure to join you tonight. I'm joining you from Gadigal lands, and as Natalie introduced, I'm going to be speaking about eco-justice in international development. And essentially, what I'm interested in is what sort of mechanisms exist for people that have been adversely affected by internationally funded development projects. And so in the short book that, that Natalie mentioned, Environmental Recourse at the Multilateral Development Banks, what I do is look at the types of accountability mechanisms that they've created to do precisely this, to provide recourse for people that have suffered environmental or social harm as a result of development projects financed by these development banks. And so as you can see on the screen, I look at the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank. I don't include the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank because it is relatively new, but it too does have an international grievance mechanism. And so these are a specific type of non-legal, non-binding avenues for recourse for people that are suffering from environmental and social harm. And I look at them for three specific reasons. The first is that they've actually amassed quite a significant experience of responding to environmental and social harm from people harmed by international development projects over the last 2 decades. So the World Bank's inspection panel was created in 1993. The Asian Development Bank's accountability mechanism was first established in 1995. And so we have quite a considerable amount of data on how they react to the types of environmental and social problems people face when there's a big development project in their area. So I look specifically at them because we have this information, and I look specifically at them because they're also public funders. These are large-scale, high-profile public funders, and because of that, they're sort of most likely cases for the grievance mechanisms to actually operate. And this compares to the relatively less transparent private sector grievance mechanisms or the lesser known and less resourced public funders. And so grievance mechanisms have proliferated throughout international development financing, and you can find them with private sector development financing. Corporations have them, bilateral development agencies have them, export credit agencies have them. But we have quite a lot of information about how the large-scale public funders like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank respond to people's concerns. And so I just want to acknowledge the picture that you see here. This is the Narmada Bacha Andalan campaign against the Narmada Dam mega project in India. We are talking about 30 to 40,000 small and medium dams and large dams crossing 3 states in India. Largest civil protest in Indian history. It really galvanized attention as to the forcible relocation of people as a result of these dam projects, the ecological impact of having such a system of dams in place, and how it affected communities. And so this really sparked the creation of these grievance mechanisms, principally for the World Bank, but would then cascade to other types of development financiers. And so that triggered the creation of the World Bank's inspection panel and would then follow on through to the creation of the Asian Development Bank's mechanism a mere 2 years later. So as I mentioned, these are non-legal, and there are really 2 types of means for recourse for people that have been harmed by development projects in the international arena. They can choose legal arrangements, and there certainly has been sort of efforts and an expansion of international courts and tribunals that increasingly start to cover environmental issues. But my research shows that there are very strong reasons for people to choose non-legal, non-binding mechanisms as a means of recourse. And this is principally because people may potentially experience reprisal, either from the state or from a corporation as a result of speaking out for what is happening to them. So what sort of impacts am I talking about? Well, I can identify that the World Bank lends approximately 20 billion annually to developing countries to finance energy, telecommunications and infrastructure projects to address poverty and improve people's lives. We know development projects can have dramatic and irreversible environmental and social impacts, loss of lives, livelihoods and land, a breakdown in community cohesion, species extinction, habitat loss, and irreparable damage to local ecosystems. Despite the World Bank's inspection panel operating for over 25 years, we still don't know how it or any other international grievance mechanism actually contributes to improving conditions in project areas, which is quite, in many ways, surprising, but they weren't given the mandate to do that. So people harmed by international development projects may still choose these non-legal mechanisms because of this fear of reprisal. And this is, of course, only accelerating. In 2019, 4 environmental defenders were killed every week for speaking out to protect their environment. This is a 30% increase from 2018. Identifying the use of international grievance mechanisms for addressing environmental and ecological injustice is therefore an imperative given the rise of conflicts from development projects globally. And I'd like to add, and this is a specific focus of my research, is that international development practices, as we know, are also contributing to the knowing of crossing known ecological system boundaries globally. The most obvious one is the contribution to climate change, but also habitat loss and species extinction. And the United Nations has outlined the contributions towards these crossing of ecological systems is likely to surpass known experience and will alter almost all human and natural systems. So it's pretty scary stuff. The 2 forms that people can take for recourse, as I said, are legal and non-legal. They could choose to go through the courts either at the national level or through at the international level. They can seek a variety of different bodies, mainly for human rights, less so for environmental recourse. So these grievance mechanisms provide this avenue for people to air their grievances as a result of either experiencing environmental and social harm or the likelihood of experiencing this harm. And so I've been really interested in trying to identify how these non-judicial processes work when they are what the banks call citizen-driven mechanisms. So people have to complain off their own initiative to these mechanisms in order to have their grievances addressed. So it's kind of important to identify whether or not it's in a community's interest to actually make a complaint to these bodies. But I argue, and this is what I'm going to talk about a little bit more now, is that the grievance mechanisms do explicitly and implicitly protect procedural environmental rights. So what do I mean by that? I look at what I'm calling EcoJustice, and this is really to locate the claims made by affected communities suffering harm, whether it's loss of land or loss of livelihood, the destruction of species, the forcible movement of peoples from their land. Looking at how development projects fit within these broader struggles for environmental, but also ecological justice. And so this is to recognise that the claims that people are making, and the sort of rules are pretty clear, it's 2 or more people in a project affected area can make a claim to these grievance mechanisms if the project is funded by these development banks, by the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank. And I locate it within this both environmental and ecological justice frames because international grievance mechanisms reflect these broader and accelerating trends, which is a recognition that there is a lack of community information and participation regarding development project impacts, and there is an imperative to address ecological devastation everywhere. So I argue that EcoJustice can best capture the worst effects of international development financing that international grievance mechanisms do have a remit to address. So the procedural and environmental rights are increasingly being codified in mainly regional conventions, but also increasingly in multilateral environmental agreements. In the European Regional Convention, the Aarhus Convention, documents these procedural and environmental rights for all signatories to the Aarhus Convention, and the Escazú Agreement that covers Latin American states also now incorporates these rights. And these are rights that are in relation to access to information about environmental matters. So people have a right to know about the impact that a development project is going to have on their local environment. A second procedural right is the right to participate in decisions on environmental matters that affect you. So this is built in to Aarhus and the Escazú agreements. And I argue that they're implicitly built into the environmental and social standards of the multilateral development banks. So they have specific information disclosure policies, and they have specific policies about consultation and participation in the development process, social impact assessments and so on. The third one is right to access for justice in environmental matters. And this is the creation of these grievance or accountability mechanisms that I've been talking about. So I locate it within these frames of EcoJustice because they capture the types of concerns that I see are already implicitly within the environmental and social standards of the multilateral development banks. But I also am really concerned about the rights of nature itself. And this really sort of leads us to think about, well, how is international development situated? And this raises this concern of the rights of nature. And this is Mount Taranaki in New Zealand, which has been identified as having a legal status and the rights and holding rights in New Zealand in 2017. And this is an increasing movement. You see it in India, you see it in Ecuador, you see it in New Zealand, where people are identifying that nature perhaps should have rights, and that these rights should be recognised. And the rights that I'm specifically talking about are the right to exist, the right to repair, and the right to regenerate. And this really speaks to the sort of generally ecological systems or ecosystems that have the right to flourish without being completely devastated by human development. So I combine these concerns into eco-justice, these environmental concerns about people's rights, about their environment, with nature's rights. And I was really, I think it's really important to think through how we talk about international development, because many communities have worldviews that don't separate people from place. And in fighting for environmental rights and the rights of nature, in actual fact, people are making claims to these grievance mechanisms that they are willing to advance both human and ecological needs. So the research that I've been doing is trying to locate people within ecosystems that are harmed at the forefront of the analysis of the grievance mechanisms, rather than just as a byproduct for determining whether or not the banks have followed their own policies in relation to environmental and social standards. So this breaks with a lot of the existing literature, which really seeks to identify whether or not the banks have done something bad. Instead, to look at really this concern with justice about whether or not people have access to information about what's going on, access to participation, access to a discussion about the redistribution of risks and benefits that the project brings to the community and to the society at large. And importantly, for a justice frame, the environmental justice frame, a rectification of the harm if it impinges on people's and ecosystems' ability to flourish. So this is fundamental to my concern about the operation of the mechanisms, because we know that a great deal of harm can result from misrecognition of communities in project areas, where communities have not been recognised as being affected by a particular development project, where the focus of international development lenders is primarily with the sovereign state, the borrower who is borrowing money for the development project, and where the interests of the banks themselves are very much focused on lending over specifically environmental and social project quality. So a failure to recognise the social needs and welfare of disadvantaged communities can lead to injustice. And of course, there are ways to try and facilitate justice through environmental and social standards. The focus on justice is also to recognise that participation or a failure to participate is important, because it can lead to greater environmental risks for communities. So a failure to be informed as to an international development project taking place within communities, or being consulted with, or providing consent for the project, can have a dramatic impact on how the project is executed, and therefore what the type of problem is for those communities. And this can contribute to severe ramifications for communities, leading to a maldistribution of environmental risks and benefits, and negative impacts on people's capabilities to lead full lives, and of course for ecosystems to continue to function. So this is to look at the ways in which the decisions are made about who should bear the brunt of a particular development project, whether or not that leads to a great deal of negative external environmental effects from the project for a greater good, including people being pushed off arable land and into ecologically fragile areas, people suffering from heightened social tensions in project areas like mines that experience transient workers and antisocial behaviours. And of course, this maldistribution can impact on people's capabilities. Affected capabilities include a loss of economic capabilities, a loss of livelihood, cultural and religious capabilities, such as the decimation of spiritual sites, physical capabilities, such as victims of abuse and intimidation and suffering the effects of toxic pollution, and political and social capabilities, such as the loss of informal representation and social cohesion. So really looking at all of these ways through which environmental justice can be, or injustice can be perpetrated, quite often inadvertently as a result of the development process, in addition to ecosystem integrity, or whether or not a development project may contribute to the degeneration of an ecosystem over time. So can the international grievance mechanisms address this harm? Well, they are fundamentally last resort mechanisms. So these are mechanisms, again, they're citizen driven. So if a community feels that they're being adversely affected, they may have been inadequately compensated for their land if that has been part of the project, or they may have not had the full effects of an environmental impact assessment undertaken, or they may identify toxicity resulting from the development project. Then they can go to these grievance mechanisms and to seek recourse. So this is, you know, as I said, one of the ways through which communities can respond to development projects that are adversely affecting them. And here I've got a team of investigators. I think this is from the World Bank Group's team, going into the field to identify what those environmental and social harms are, whether or not they have been the result of the non-compliance with the environmental and social policies of the bank in undertaking the lending. And so we can see that there's a whole variety of different grievance mechanisms that exist at the international level. The UN is now taking an extreme interest in how grievance mechanisms are working at the international level. This is the Zagelmeyer reference. It's the United Nations Office of Human Rights to identify whether or not they are doing what they say they are doing. And certainly there's no evidence that they are actually working in private development, particularly in relation to the ones being run by companies themselves, multinational corporations. There is also a whole host of industry and sector-specific international grievance mechanisms that are operating. So, for example, the Fair Labour Association has one, Rugmark has one. These are often brokered between industries and NGOs, and they can have quite mixed results. Kate McDonald's work from the University of Melbourne, they quite often talk about this as being accountability by proxy, which is where consumers in the global north are effectively brokering what they want the company or the industry to be accountable for on behalf of people in the global south. And so this obviously has its own difficulties in terms of it's there for people in developing countries to air their grievances, but it has been designed not by them, not by themselves. And just something on the horizon is that there will be a UN report coming out on development financing and really seeking to identify what it is that the multilateral development banks are accountable for. So there is increasing interest in whether or not these mechanisms can work. And I've been looking specifically at the multilateral development banks, as I've said. And this gets us to looking at what they're sort of telling us about grievance. And I've pulled out the data from the Asian Development Bank. As I said, the AIIB is relatively new itself. It created its mechanism only in 2018. So I didn't include that because there's no real data. But I did an analysis of the claims going to the multilateral development banks, and my personal website, susanmpark.com, I think, actually has the database that you can download for free, and you can cut the data up any way you like. But it goes by bank, and it goes by country, and it goes by year, and it goes by project. So you can look up any project you like and see what happened to the claim made by people. Now, obviously, these are only claims that are have been made public by the community. They can choose whether or not they want to remain anonymous or remain confidential, I should say. So what we know from the database that I've collected, is publicly available information from all of the multilateral development banks. I've collected over 1,000 claims submitted by communities to have their grievances addressed. And of those, I've identified which ones have original submissions. And so here I've pulled out the original submissions submitted by people to the Asian Development Bank to get a better sense of what it is that people are seeking recourse for. And, you know, we're looking at about over 40% of claims to the Asian Development Bank really seeking recourse for a lack of information, like they haven't been told about the project in their community and in their environment. 40% of claimants reference a lack of participation. They haven't been involved in the development process. They haven't in any way been asked their opinion, let alone consented to the development project that is going to affect them. And over 15% of claims to the Asian Development Bank do identify that they are concerned about their local environment, irrespective of the impact that it has on their own life and livelihood. So outside human dependence, say for fishing or for other human or economic activity. And so approximately 73, I've been able to pull out 73 original complaints that have been made to the Asian Development Bank from 1995 through to 2019 to identify what it is that people are concerned about. And this is the table that you can see here. And the focus is, let's see if I can move this so you can see it better, down the bottom. You're looking at about over 10 of these original complaints have been concerned about abuse, direct abuse to themselves, physical intimidation and threats. Capabilities, again, refers to broad capabilities, including the ones that I mentioned, economic, social, religious, and economic. So people are concerned about how the project affects their ability to flourish. Economic, and then we break down those modes. So there's economic capabilities in yellow, followed by physical capabilities, religious and cultural capabilities, social capabilities. But by far and away for the Asian Development Bank, the biggest concern is distribution, the distribution of impacts of risks and rewards that are going to come from the project. So over 70% of those claims were concerned about that. Now, just to give you an idea of the data, people do clearly have more than one grievance, and you can identify that, or we can identify that within the claims. So the concerns, environment is right next to the big bar. So you can see that people are concerned about the environment irrespective of their dependence on it. But by far and away, distribution is the biggest concern that people have about what's happening with the development project. A far lesser concern, but still around 30% or just over 30 claims is the lack of consent or lack of informed consent, the lack of participation, and the lack of recognition. You know, have they been recognised? Have their concerns been addressed? And so this gives you a sort of bit of an idea as what, to my mind, really confirmed that EcoJustice is a concern in the Asia Pacific and for Southeast Asia. And just to give you an idea, I did a quick breakdown of looking at the Asian Development Banks, like the spread of countries where the complaints were coming from. And by far and away, and I think this really speaks to the Asian Development Bank's changing portfolio, comes from Central Asia. It doesn't come from Southeast Asia. And again, Southeast Asian Development Bank only really opened up to Central Asia relatively recently, but that is where most of the complaints are coming from. Now, that's not to suggest that there aren't development projects that aren't subject to claims in Southeast Asia, particularly coming from countries like Cambodia and Indonesia. These are projects, again, are there, the grievance mechanisms are there to address these concerns and to seek to ameliorate people's concerns in terms of the environmental and social impacts that the projects have. So really, the way in which I can think about it is that these are, in many ways, less than 1% of the Asian Development Bank's overall portfolio of projects. So it's a very small number of projects that come to the grievance mechanism. And as I said, these are last resort mechanisms. So by far and away, most of the complaints are dealt with before they get to this stage. So what does that mean? It means if there's a power plant, if there's a road, if there's telecommunications tower being built and it's financed by the ADB or any of the other multilateral development banks, then communities have can go to the executing agency, generally the government department in charge, whether it's the Department of Energy or the Department of Transport, to request information and to make a complaint. If there is no success there, then they can take it up the chain. And if with no reasonable response, they can then lodge a complaint with the grievance mechanism. And it's then investigated. And that's a choice between whether or not to sit down with the community. And it's up to the community now to choose whether or not they want to discuss and seek to try and solve the problem, or whether or not they would like to go to a compliance investigation that identifies that the bank has not followed its policies and that some recommendation for redress should apply. And so this is my final point, which is that the results do indicate that these grievance mechanisms do provide recourse for harm. And what this means is that, yes, they are a place where people can have their grievances heard and discussed. And again, this can be through the problem-solving process, or it can be through the compliance investigation process. It's very, very difficult, however, because the grievance mechanisms aren't mandated to do so, to know whether or not people are actually better off after a complaint. And I think that's really critical, because some of these complaints can go on for years. Some of them can be very, very complex. And of course, they can raise community tensions and make things very, very difficult. And so that's really the focus of my work going forward, is to actually identify, is this a good choice for people that are suffering environmental and social harm? Is it worthwhile using these international grievance mechanisms? So I'm going to stop there and hopefully move to questions. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Susan. For those of you who might not have heard it, I did have the opportunity to interview Susan for our SEAC Stories podcast. I think it was last year. So if you haven't listened to that podcast, I encourage you to do so. But Susan, even though I've spoken to you about your research before, I really enjoyed tonight's presentation. And we've got lots of questions, great questions through the chat. I just wanted to ask a couple myself before I come to the ones in the chat. You said that the minimum number of people required to make a grievance claim is 2. What are the sort of average and upper limits that you might see in these sort of cases?
Yeah, so it does vary really widely. It can be hundreds to thousands of people. I was actually trying to think if there was if I knew of a case in Southeast Asia. But one of the issues is that there can be multiple claims made at the same time without people perhaps even realising it. So community, and I'm thinking of Cambodia at this point, where there were 4 separate claims made on behalf of different collections of people within Cambodia making those claims. And when that happens, they negotiate with the communities and say, would you mind if we roll it into one big claim?
That's interesting, because I might have suspected that they would encourage the dilution of those claims, actually, by keeping people separate. So who coordinates the grievance mechanisms? Does it come back to the banks, or are people responsible for self-advocacy and self-community organising?
So it's both. On the one hand, the grievance mechanisms, they're paid for by the bank, they're bank staff, but they are completely separate from the project operations of the bank. So they, in the Asian Development Bank's case, they're bifurcated mechanisms. So the problem solving, if you've got a grievance and you want the bank to solve it, then that comes under bank management. So it is part of the operations of the bank. Clearly, the department that has been working on the project is not involved, but they then work with the government and with the community to address the problem. If they want a compliance investigation, then there's a team of compliance investigators. And that's much more like interviewing the community to say, well, what happened and then what happened and how are you affected, and documenting that, and then compiling evidence and then evaluating it against the policies of the bank, and then making a decision and then making a recommendation to the bank as to how it should be fixed. And that goes to the Board of Executive Directors, which is basically the member states. So it is a great deal of organisation that comes from the community itself in terms of, does anyone know about this mechanism? Is it worthwhile going to? How many people want to be involved? And NGOs play a very big role in making communities aware that this is an option, and also being a little bit sceptical as to what they'll get out.
Yes, and I mean, I guess those activists and advocates within community groups also played a role in raising awareness about the impact of these development projects in the first place. I mean, did they play a role in the development of these accountability and grievance mechanisms?
Absolutely, they were fundamental to it. So the Narmada Dam campaign that I talked about in the sort of, well, it was the 1980s, but really hit the bank in terms of creating this grievance mechanism, the inspection panel in 1993, was a massive transnational campaign between Indian activists and NGOs in Washington, DC, and being able to transmit information as to what was happening in the states like Madhya Pradesh in India to Washington, DC based NGOs, who were then speaking to World Bank executive directors saying, this is happening, this is real, you need to respond to this. So NGOs have been absolutely vital to the creation of these mechanisms.
Okay, one of the points that you raised was how in some places where these accountability mechanisms are operating, there is not necessarily a distinction between the human and the more than human world. So I've got a question here. Does global governance take into account the more than human world? It seems like the concept of justice has been predominantly confined to humanity, with a strong focus on social justice and environmental justice, but always with this strong anthropocentric bias. But of course, you know, a lot of our SEAC members are working on the more than human world. Is global governance working on this as well?
It's not. That's the short answer. You know, because I've been watching as these communities all around the world have been arguing for rights for nature and winning in some cases. And I've been really fascinated by this, because all of the institutions that I can think of, the United Nations Environment Programme, the Multilateral Development Banks, they are all anthropocentric. It's absolutely true. They are focused on humans in their environment. So, and I think that's a kind of awareness of how the environment impinges on our consciousness as a result of the process of industrialization. So we go out there, we build factories, you know, we use fossil fuels, you know, nature is there to be used. But of course, we're beginning to recognize that we are situated within nature, and nature has these sort of feedback loops that we're only just now becoming much more conscious of. And it's a very, very, very big shift to think about how our institutions can actually be reconciled to that way of thinking, and they're not. And I mean, even, you know, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and COP26 and all the stuff that we're seeing now is still trying to figure out how to save humanity. which is very, very different from, you know, the 6 mass species extinction that we're existing in now, which doesn't get anywhere near the same coverage as climate change, but is going to have very, very real impacts as well.
Yeah, the decline in biodiversity, absolutely, great concern. Thank you, Susan. Very interesting answers. Now I would like to come to some of the questions from our audience. This is a really straightforward one from Sandra, which I love in its directness. Thank you, Sandra Alday. What would explain why these issues were not picked up at the impact assessment stage of the project?
Great question. I think there's a whole bunch of things that can go wrong. And some of that could be due to lack of capacity. Some of it could be lack of oversight. Some of it is very much based on the organisational culture of the multilateral development banks. And I'm not sure about the bilateral lenders. Maybe people in the room know more about bilateral lending than I do. But the multilateral development banks definitely have a sort of incentive culture to approve loans. So their job is to get the deal. And that's something that sort of is built into the incentive structures for investment officers that work for these banks. And that's not a bad thing. You know, everyone responds to incentive structures. You know, what gets us out of bed to go to work? We get paid. So that's not a bad thing. But the incentive structures don't actually have never really been built. The environmental and social impacts haven't been built into the incentive structures, which means that they're seen as a burden. They said, oh, I have to do the environmental impact assessment. I have to tick this. I have to make sure that all my T's are crossed and my I's are dotted. It's not actually built into the fact that if you don't do those things, it's going to cost more. It's going to take longer. You're going to fundamentally create a massive problem for communities. And so the cost of not doing that is not really thought of in the same way. I think in many ways we need to flip the discussion about sustainable development, whereas if you want true sustainable development, it takes longer. It takes longer to get communities fully across and participating in building something that is going to work for them. But that's not how most development is done. So it's a bit of a long-winded response, but I think you know, there's a whole bunch of factors, but fundamentally how we do development help exacerbate problems.
Yeah, really interesting. Okay, I'm going to come to another one of our questions from Nikki Duncan, who is I think she's an honours student. Welcome, Nikki. You mentioned that some grievance processes are open to claims in which people believe that organisational processes have not been followed. What about when those processes have been followed, but they're inappropriate or insufficient?
That's a problem. That is a big problem.
Nikki always asks great questions, so there you go.
It's a fabulous question because it really hits it on the head. If you cannot link non-compliance to harm, then there's nothing that can be done. If they followed their policies, that's fine, right? So the actual connection is really, really important. The banks have to demonstrate they have, as a result of their non-compliance, the harm has occurred. If the harm has occurred, even though they followed their procedures, what are you going to do, right? You know, if you follow because they're now bifurcated, you can take the problem-solving approach. If you choose problem-solving, then the aim is to be proactive and to actually solve the problem irrespective of whether or not the harm is caused by the non-compliance of the bank. So that's, I think, the direction that most of the grievance mechanisms are taking, that people do want to solve the problem. They don't want to apportion blame. They just want to get the problem fixed.
Okay, terrific. We have two questions sort of about the global north and the global south, which I'd like to come to now. You mentioned some grievance processes are designed in the global north for implementation in the global south. So the two questions flowing from that: has there been any analysis of the extent to which expectations and aspirations align or differ between the north and the south? And the second question, are there any examples of it flowing in the opposite direction where these standards have been developed in the south and have been applied in the north?
That's wonderful. I really like this question. One of the things that I've been looking at is, I see this as a proliferation of a norm, a certain way of dealing with a problem. And the original World Bank Inspection Panel was very, it was seen as punitive, and it was seen as investigatory. We're going to investigate the bank. We're going to see if the bank's done the wrong thing. And that created a huge backlash within the World Bank. Hey, we're just trying to do development here. There's been some problems, but don't blame us. And so this really combative style of investigation was then exported. So it was designed in the global north, and it was exported to all of the regional development banks. So the Asian Development Bank created one very similar to the World Bank Inspection Panel. It had some slight differences. It was called the inspection function, and it didn't really work because in the Asia Pacific, to call out somebody as being, you've caused harm, people lose face, and it was seen as being just not what people wanted in a mechanism that was supposedly for communities to be able to air their grievances. And so the design, so the Asian Development Bank was really impressive. It had probably its largest sort of stakeholder roundtables in the region and also outside the region to talk about, well, what is it the communities would like as a sort of mechanism for recourse for them. And they all said they wanted the problem solved, which is where this idea of problem solving actually comes from. It comes from the Asia Pacific, it comes from the region, it comes from stakeholders saying, this is what we want. And so the Asian Development Bank redesigned its mechanism with this bifurcated strategy. You could go for problem solving. You could say, I just want to sit down with the executing agency, with the bank. The community wants to know whether or not we can reroute the project or have our concerns addressed, and also keep that compliance investigation process. Like if that doesn't work, then we'll go to compliance. Then we'll find out if the bank did wrong and can be forced to fix it. And that model then got taken up and is now the model that is being used. So last year, the World Bank Inspection Panel adopted this problem-solving approach as well.
Amazing, wonderful. That is really a surprising answer, actually. I wanted to ask you, this question's a little bit out of left field. So I don't want to put you on the spot. See how we go with this one. Can art play a role in bringing about eco-justice in terms of enacting change in destructive systems and as a means for communities to process trauma?
Can. Absolutely. I mean, art provides such a window into the human experience, and I think it's incredibly important about any issue affecting us to be able to express what that means. And we learn and know in different ways. And I'm particularly struck by the fact that so many of the communications around grievance are really focused on the written word and around access to technology. So the assumption that communities all have the internet, they all speak English, they all can understand exactly what the policies of the banks are in order to make a complaint. But in actual fact, I mean, oral stories, ways of knowing, these are all very much part of a sort of broader understanding of our place in the world and in our communities and in our ecosystems. This is how we know. And so I think art plays a very important role. I haven't come across too much, I have to say, about how communities do convey the information about the mechanisms, and I'd be really curious to actually know that. But I am also aware of the fact that what gets to people about some of these really important claims are through documentaries. I'm constantly, I have these discussions with people where they say, oh, I saw this documentary about that project. And I'm like, oh my God, that's amazing. And so there's just ways of knowing that through art and yeah, it's just amazing.
You might want to suggest some of those documentaries for us. Maybe we could do some screenings, which would be wonderful, actually, as an entry point for further discussion on this topic. Now we have really got a lot of questions and answers out of you, Susan, so I don't want to push my luck. I have one more question for you. Thank you for being so generous with your wonderful answers. You've talked about the evolution of these accountability and grievance mechanisms. Where do you see them going next?
Great question. So in some research I've recently completed, what I've noticed about the grievance mechanisms of the Multilateral Development Banks is that they've become much more transparent over time, so over a 20-year period. And the Asian Development Bank in 2016 did a sort of dump of information, which was so important to researchers like me, where, I'd been piecing together, over time, they'd been releasing information about complaints and updating them. So you knew that, okay, well, this community has gone for problem solving. They're in the mediation phase. They've been, their claim has been acknowledged and they're working through it. Or this community has gone straight for a compliance investigation and it's been determined that the bank has followed its policies, and that's the end of the story. So I've been really impressed with the fact that they're providing much more information. So they're more transparent, they're more responsive to communities. Communities can now comment on the process in many ways. They've become much more robust in terms of being able to monitor what the banks are doing if they've been found non-compliant. So being able to, so the banks basically have to say, okay, we've been found non-compliant, we have to rectify these 6 issues in order to be compliant with our policies and to address the community's grievances. And so the inspection panel and the other mechanisms have now been able to look over the bank management's shoulder and say, yes, okay, you have done that. All right, we independently can confirm that you have rectified that issue. So that's incredibly important because, as I said, nobody, I've not seen any information that communities are actually better off as a result of going to these grievance mechanisms. So to have that independent monitoring where the banks have been found non-compliant and have had to rectify it and have had to demonstrate that to the mechanisms is really, really important. The other thing is whether or not the banks are getting better at the problem solving. And the issue here is obviously when you have tensions over a project and people have lost livelihoods or they've lost, connection to a spiritual site. I mean, these are real questions. How do you move on from that? And that's really, really difficult. And in many cases, I mean, the Asian Development Bank, as with some of the other banks, they lend not just to the government, but they lend to the private sector as well. And so a company can basically choose not to engage and say, no, the community doesn't want to, wants to sit down and work out this problem. We don't. And so there's no onus on private companies to do that. And so I see the real issue here being, how do you empower communities to be able to take that seat at the table and to negotiate and discuss in a problem solving or mediation type situation where they are equals. And I think that's the work that needs to be done. So I've seen some instances of really good mediation. I've seen some not so good ones. So I think that's the direction they need to take.
Susan, I could talk to you about this for hours, but I know our time is coming to an end and you've really provided such rich food for thought tonight. Thank you very much for sharing your time and your knowledge with the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre. We always say last but not least, but it's very much the case in your case. So once again, thank you so much. It's just been fabulous. So a really wonderful end to the series.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us.